While a good quarterback can totally transform a franchise into a giant, a bad quarterback can have exactly the same effect. While we've covered the top 5 greatest quarterbacks of all time, we figured it was only fair we covered the 5 worst quarterbacks of all time. Just a few criteria we selected for today's video is that we're only covering quarterbacks from the Super Bowl era, quarterbacks who had at least one season as a starter for at least 14 games. And I'm not gonna pick obvious draft busts like Jamarcus Russell or Ryan Leaf. I'm not gonna dunk on some backup who wasn't really expected to play in the first place, or someone out of the league in 2 years. However, it's a fun list and I think you guys will enjoy it. The 5th quarterback on our list is someone who fluked his way to a pretty good record on paper, but the full picture tells a very different story, and that is Mark Sanchez. Mark Sanchez had a solid career at USC, with a career total of 4,000 passing yards, 41 touchdowns, and 16 interceptions. One questionable thing about him is that his last year as a junior was his only year as a full starter. He passed for 320 yards and 34 touchdowns, which is great, but gave NFL teams very limited film to analyze his true talent for the NFL level. Despite that, the Jets decided to draft him with the 5th overall pick of the 2009 NFL draft. They thought he could finally be the franchise quarterback they have been searching for since Joe Namath. The Jets had given up quite a bit to trade up to draft Sanchez and gave him a 5-year, $50 million contract to get him to sign. He won the starting job going into his rookie year. He wound up with 2,400 yards and 12 touchdowns to 20 interceptions. Despite this mediocre season, he wound up somehow playing in the AFC Championship game, but falling to the Colts. Despite losing this game, he ended up on several all-rookie teams, and many Jets fans thought they had secured their future franchise quarterback who had the potential to lead them to the promised land. In 2011, hopes were high, and Sanchez delivered another perfectly okay season. This year, the Jets improved to a great 11-5 record, and he threw for 3,200 yards, 17 touchdowns, and 13 interceptions. Somehow, he won games in the playoffs against the Indianapolis Colts and New England Patriots before falling in the AFC Championship once again to the Pittsburgh Steelers. At this point, while his play had been pretty mediocre, he had earned pretty solid favor within the organization due to this back-to-back AFC Championship appearances. In 2011, he had his career best season with 3,400 yards and 26 touchdowns, but that was a far cry from what was necessary to carry this team to even further playoff success. In 2012, he drastically regressed and threw for under 3,000 yards, and officially earned the title of mid-tier quarterback. While he did ride an elite defense to 2 straight AFC Championship games, the truth is, if the Jets had a more explosive quarterback in those years, there is a good chance they would have had a Super Bowl title. Mark Sanchez met the benchmark of serviceable quarterback who was just good enough to not replace, but also wasn't good enough to really push the team over the hump and get them to a title. In 2013, he suffered a severe shoulder injury in the 3rd preseason game and was out for the year. He was released in the offseason, and his days as a starter were over. After that, he had a solid season with the Eagles, and then settled into his role as a backup with the Eagles, Cowboys, Bears, and Redskins. He officially retired in 2018, and while he was definitely a below-average journeyman quarterback, it is especially embarrassing that he wasn't able to perform as a top 5 pick in any draft class. The thing that really gets Sanchez on this list is also his negative touchdown to interception ratio. Anytime he had success, he was really riding an elite defense to the promised land. He wound up 37-36 as a starter with 86 touchdowns to 89 interceptions. Tim Couch had been an absolute stud at the University of Kentucky. While his freshman year had been a bit of a disaster, in 1997 he proceeded to break several school records. He threw for 3,800 yards, 37 touchdowns, and 19 interceptions, which ranked the offense amongst the highest in the league. With a quarterback rating of 141.6, he was one of the highest ranked quarterbacks in the nation. He followed this up in 1998 with an even better season where he racked up 4,200 yards, 36 touchdowns, and 15 interceptions. By this point, he was one of the hottest prospects being talked about on the NFL level, and he declared for the draft after the season wrapped up. In 1999, the Cleveland Browns were the owners of the 1st overall pick, and they decided to select Tim Couch with the 1st pick. While the Browns had just come back to the league after the franchise left for Baltimore in 1996, many fans had hoped Couch could have been the first franchise quarterback in the team's history. He took over the starting role in the 2nd game of his his rookie year, he threw for 2,400 yards, 15 touchdowns, and 13 interceptions. But considering how bad this new franchise was in terms of a supporting cast, that wasn't the worst season in history. Even though the performance was not great by any means, it did do quite a bit to earn him support from the Browns fans. In 2000, he had regressed quite a bit, and through the first 7 games, he threw for 1,400 yards and 7 touchdowns to 9 interceptions. He broke his thumb, and while he hadn't played at a high level before, this injury truly did set his career back by a large margin. He was never able to recover 100% from the broken thumb injury he endured. In 2001, he got another start at the starting job and managed to make an appearance in all 16 games. He threw for just over 3,000 yards and 17 touchdowns to 21 interceptions in his only full season. Even with this being his best season, the Browns still ended up going 7-9. He got one more chance at the starting job in 2003, but would only start 8 games, with it being one of his worst seasons yet. Once his season ended with injury, he was released in early 2004. He did manage to get a chance on the Green Bay Packers. He wasn't able to hang onto his role through training camp. He had suffered a rotator cuff injury while in Cleveland that would eventually require surgery, and the Packers weren't willing to wait while he was recovering from injury. After not making their 53-man roster, he had a tryout with the Chicago Bears, Cincinnati Bengals, and Tennessee Titans before he signed a contract with the Jacksonville Jaguars in 2007, where he was placed in a competition for the 3rd-string quarterback slot on the depth chart. He wasn't able to win the competition and was cut, officially forcing him out of the league that year. While he did bounce around from roster to roster a bit after leaving Cleveland, he never officially played in an NFL game after the 2003 season. Despite him not having too great of a career, he still holds several Browns all-time records. He is 2nd all-time in completion percentages, 5th in pass completions, 6th in yardage, and that just goes to show how bad the Browns have been at the quarterback position since they were brought back to the league. From Tim Couch to Deshaun Watson, it's pretty clear that this entire organization has absolutely zero ability to make good choices when it comes to the quarterback position. They did give him 5 full seasons to try to figure it out, but in the modern NFL, we're lucky to see a QB stay in Cleveland for more than a year or 2. Chris Weinke had originally started his athletic career as a baseball player. He was drafted in the 2nd round of the 1990 MLB draft and was working his way up through the minor league affiliates. However, he felt that his potential baseball career was never going to pan out as he hoped, so he stepped away in 1996 and returned to Florida State University, this time to play football for the school. He was 25 years old as a freshman college player, but in 1998 he led the team to a 9-1 record and a number 2 overall ranking before he had a serious neck injury. He bounced back in 1999 and led the Seminoles to their first undefeated national championship, and in his senior year followed it up with a Heisman Trophy and a national championship appearance. Obviously, anyone who has a career like that is going to get NFL attention, but it's important to remember that Weinke was 28 years old by the time he won the Heisman Trophy. His age pushed him back quite a bit on most draft boards. While he was clearly talented, there was no way he would be able to have as long of a career as his peers. He wound up being selected by the Panthers in the 4th round of the 2001 draft, and eventually became their starter, where he would lead them to a 1-15 record. At the time, the 15 straight losses the Panthers had were an NFL record for most consecutive losses. It wasn't like Weinke wasn't throwing the ball either. He had also broken the record for most passing attempts per game for a rookie. His only season as a full starter, he threw for under 3,000 yards, 11 touchdowns, and 19 interceptions. Clearly after that, the Panthers knew they needed a bit more talent at the quarterback position, and they wound up signing Jake Delhomme to replace Weinke. He would stay in Carolina for some years as a backup before moving to San Francisco for a single season to be a backup as well. Overall, his record as a starter is an abysmal 2-18 record, with final career stats of just under 4,000 yards passing, 15 touchdowns, and 26 interceptions. As much as we are used to quarterbacks not playing well, I feel like Weinke drastically underperformed even the lowest expectations. To be able to play baseball as essentially a professional, before then going on one of the most prolific college football careers in history, had many thinking he could be a huge star. His dropping to the 4th round was mainly due to his old age, but I don't think anyone expected a 1-2 touchdown to interception ratio. His story reminds me a lot of Brandon Weeden, who was a Browns quarterback who came into the league at about 28 and wasn't able to adjust to the new level of the game quick enough to keep his job as a starting QB. David Klingler destroyed several records for the Houston Cougars over his 4-year college career. He initially wasn't the starter for his first 2 seasons, but in 1990 threw for over 5,000 yards and 54 touchdowns to 20 interceptions. He even broke the record for most touchdowns in a single game when he threw 11 touchdowns in one game against Eastern Washington. That season was enough to get almost everyone in the NFL looking in his direction. He also threw for 716 yards in a single game, and in 1991 followed it up with another great year despite starting one less game due to injury. Going into the 1992 draft, the Bengals were searching for someone who could make the team finally not suck. They selected Klingler with the 6th overall pick of the 1992 draft. He wasn't named as the starter going into his rookie year, but did manage to start 4 games when the starter went down with injury. In those 4 games, he went 1-3 and threw for only 530 yards and 3 touchdowns alongside 2 interceptions. With a completion percentage below 50%, many fans were starting to think they could have made a serious mistake drafting him so high in the draft. In his 2nd year, he was named the starter, but played even worse than he had as a rookie. In 14 games, he threw for under 2,000 yards, 6 touchdowns, and 9 interceptions. He managed to win only 3 games, and the following year, he wasn't able to hang on to his starting role for the entire season after starting 0-7. By this point, the Bengals knew they had drafted a dud. He had a record of 4-20 as a starter, and it seemed like him completing 60% of his passes was a dream with no basis in reality. In fact, his 2nd season as a starter was so bad that he ended up losing his job to Jeff Blake, who had been a 6th round pick in the same draft they selected Klingler. Jeff Blake would go on to have 2 great years in Cincinnati, and Klingler found himself without a job. It made no sense to pay out a large contract to a player who simply wasn't worth the money, but Klingler wasn't out of the NFL yet. Despite having a serious elbow surgery that drastically reduced his throwing power, he would spend 2 years in Oakland as a backup where he never played in more than 1 game a season. Despite the high expectations, the reality was that he was never going to be able to play like he did before he was injured, and he decided to step away from the game of football entirely. After the NFL, he ended up getting a master's degree in theology with a PhD in Old Testament studies. He now is a director of the college he got his degree at and works as an analyst from time to time for his former college football program. While he did not have a great career by any means, he did get to the NFL and get a few massive paychecks, so I think in the long run he got the last laugh. The Bengals are another franchise that struggled for a long time to get a true franchise quarterback until today when they have Joe Burrow. Before we get to the number 1 spot, I wanted to talk about a few quarterbacks who almost made our list, but weren't bad enough to make the cut. The first is Jack Trudeau, who played for Illinois. He broke most school records in regards to yards and touchdowns, and came out of college a relatively well-desired prospect. The Colts selected him in the 2nd round of the 1986 NFL Draft, and they immediately thrust him into the spotlight where he started 11 games as a rookie. He lost every game he appeared in as a rookie, throwing for 8 touchdowns and 18 interceptions. In 1987, he split the starting duties with 2 other quarterbacks, but still struggled with interceptions. And in 1989, he got his last true start to lead an NFL team. He managed to go 7-5 through these games with 15 touchdowns to 13 interceptions, but he just wasn't good enough to actually secure a starting job for the long term. That didn't stop him from staying on the Colts as a serviceable backup for the better part of a decade. This guy was the definition of Mr. Consistent Paycheck. Despite a total record as a start of 19-30, he still stayed on the team for 7 years. After the Colts, he bounced to the Jets and the Panthers, but by 1995, it was clear he just was never going to be able to cut it on the NFL level. Over his 10-year NFL career, he threw for 10,000 yards, 42 touchdowns, 69 interceptions, and had a career passer rating of 63.3 across 67 games. I do have to give him credit for being able to stay in the league so long despite being so bad at playing football at the NFL level. Our next honorable mention is Jack Thompson. Jack had a solid college career at Washington State University and was pretty acclaimed going into the 1979 NFL Draft. The Bengals, who had the 3rd overall pick, did have Ken Anderson, who was 30 years old at the time, but thought it was time to start building for the future. So when they were on the clock, they selected Jack Thompson with the 3rd pick. While Ken Anderson had been set as the starter for the beginning of the season, Thompson did have limited playtime in 9 games. In those 9 games, he threw for under 500 yards, 1 touchdown, and 5 interceptions. While he did manage to rush for another 5 touchdowns, it was clear he was having trouble adjusting to the NFL level. He did win the starting job in 1980, but was benched after a 6-for-21 game where he threw for just 47 yards. Over that season, he did manage to throw for 1,300 yards, 11 touchdowns, and 12 interceptions, but after that was heavily relegated to the backup for Ken Anderson. Ken Anderson proceeded to have incredible seasons for the Bengals that led to them making a Super Bowl appearance. After that year, he left and signed a contract with the Buccaneers, who named him their starter for the upcoming year. That year in Tampa, he went 2-11 in his starts, throwing for 2,900 yards, 18 touchdowns, and 21 interceptions. While he had done okay enough with the Bengals to earn another chance, it was now extremely clear that he just wasn't capable of playing at a high level in the NFL. The Buccaneers brought in Steve DeBerg to replace him as a starter, and after spending one more year in Tampa as a backup, he was out of the league shortly after. He had a final record of 4-17 as a starter, with 33 touchdowns to 45 interceptions across that span. Mike Phipps had a great career at Purdue, and in 1970 he was selected by the Cleveland Browns with the 3rd overall pick they had acquired by trading Paul Warfield to the Dolphins in exchange for their pick. For his first 2 years, he was mostly a backup quarterback, but in his limited play, he was an absolute mess. His first year, he started 1 game and had 1 touchdown to 5 interceptions, and the following year had 1 touchdown to 4 interceptions. In 1972, he got a chance to start and rode an elite running game and defense to a 10-3 record, throwing for under 2,000 yards, 13 touchdowns, and 16 interceptions. In 1972, he got another chance to be the starter, but regressed quite a bit, throwing 20 interceptions to just 9 touchdowns on 1,700 yards. At this point, he would spend a few more years in Cleveland, but his interception issues would never disappear. In 1975, he started 11 games and threw just 4 touchdowns to 19 interceptions. The Browns had given him nearly half a decade to prove he had what it took to play at a high level in the NFL, but he had shown them time and time again that he wasn't capable of playing on this level. Phipps did spend some time in Chicago, but ended his career with 55 touchdowns to 108 interceptions on 10,000 passing yards. While he did have a record of 38-31 as a starter, most of that came from riding insanely stacked run games and elite defense to wins on the back of horrible quarterback play. The number 1 spot on our list is another person who managed to turn being below average into a pretty long starting career in the NFL, and that is Joey Harrington. Joey Harrington played at the University of Oregon and started 3 years for the team. He finished his college career with 7,000 yards, 59 touchdowns, 23 interceptions, and a 25-3 record. While that might not be the yardage teams were looking for, it was combined with him being a smart quarterback who was thought to have a more cerebral approach to the game. In the 2002 NFL Draft, he was selected by the Detroit Lions with the 3rd overall pick, and he wound up taking over for their current starting quarterback late in their first game. The Lions had absolutely no offensive line, and his rookie year saw him running for his life with a 50% completion percentage, 12 touchdowns, and 16 interceptions. The Lions went 3-13, and the following year he threw for 2,800 yards with 17 touchdowns and 22 interceptions. With an overall quarterback rating of 63.9, many in Detroit were starting to realize this single player couldn't fix their team. 2004 saw Joey play at his absolute peak, throwing for 3,000 yards, 19 touchdowns, and 12 interceptions, but he regressed quite a bit in 2005 and was released from the Lions franchise at the end of the year. He took over for an injured Dante Culpepper, but once again fit the definition of mid entirely. His frequent interceptions almost always outpaced his ability to score, and his completion percentage also left quite a bit to be desired, regardless of the rosters he found himself on. After that single year in Miami, he moved on to the Falcons, where he once again was thrust into a starting role from unforeseen circumstances. This time it was Michael Vick being arrested. In that season, he started 10 games and threw for just over 2,200 yards, 7 touchdowns, and 8 interceptions. He would sign to the Saints in 2008, but didn't play that year and retired after. I feel like this guy had some weird guardian angel who really wanted him to be a starting QB in the NFL, cause it seems like everywhere he went, a situation just appeared that put him in control of a franchise's future. Who would have expected the Falcons starting quarterback to end up in prison and give him a starting role after 6 seasons of mediocre play? Over Harrington's career in 76 starts, he completed 55% of his passes for 14,000 yards, with an average 5.8 yards, 79 touchdowns, and 85 interceptions. Realistically, I think that he should have been relegated to the backup role after 2003, but him being such a high draft pick put a lot of pressure on the franchise to keep him on the field for as long as possible. Overall, he was the definition of should have been replaced 2 seasons ago, and while he seems like a nice guy, he was not a good NFL quarterback. Those are the 5 worst quarterbacks in NFL history, in my opinion. I did my best to stay away from the names we've all heard a million times, and I wanted people who started for a bit longer than a single season. I know people like Akili Smith and Jamarcus Russell were worse. They were out of the league so quick that they are more a blip in history than someone who spent 8 years being a bad starting quarterback. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed it, be sure to press the like button and let me know in the comments section who the worst quarterback in your franchise's history is. We post videos like this often, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so we can hit 10,000 subs this year.